I caught her red-handed. I was walking out to my truck, keys in hand, ready to head up to my cabin when I noticed a couple I didn't recognize dragging 2 suitcases up my driveway. They looked confused, glancing at their phones, then at the number on the side of my house. "Can I help you?" I asked, stepping off the porch. The man straightened up. Yeah, we're here for the weekend rental. Is this the right place?" Olivia said it was the green cabin with the red shutters. Olivia Nevers, the HOA president, the Queen Karen of Ridge Pine Estates. Always with her clipboard and that smug, nasal voice that made every board meeting feel like a hostage situation. "This isn't a rental," I said, eyebrows raised. "That's my personal cabin." The woman blinked. "Wait, you're not on Airbnb?" "No," I said flatly, "because this is my property." And no one, not Airbnb, not Olivia, not even the HOA has the right to let strangers into it. They looked mortified. Apologetic, even. I told them to wait there and walked straight back inside. I grabbed my phone, dialed Olivia's number, and she answered like she'd just won a sweepstakes. "Oh, hi, Jonah," she chirped. "I was just about to call you. Why are there strangers trying to stay at my cabin?" I asked. "Oh, don't be so uptight," she said. "The HOA board voted to temporarily use unoccupied cabins for our overflow guests for this weekend's home and garden tour. Yours looked empty, so we assumed." "You assumed wrong," I snapped. "And you don't get to use my property. That's illegal, Olivia. You can't just hand out the keys to someone's cabin." "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You never use it, and it's for community enrichment. You should be grateful we chose yours." That's when I saw red. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just hung up. And I got the heavy-duty padlock from my garage, drove up to the cabin, and locked every single access point: front door, back porch, even the shed. Then I left town with the only set of keys and didn't answer a single call for a week. When I came back, the HOA office looked like a war zone. The guests had apparently arrived before Olivia could check them in, wandered around the property, and when they couldn't get in, called the police thinking they'd been scammed. The officers, very curious about why a private property had been advertised as a rental by someone who didn't own it, had started asking questions. But the best part, apparently, Olivia had made physical copies of my cabin key, which she wasn't authorized to have. She'd gotten them from a locksmith by lying and saying she was my sister. I sat calmly at the next HOA meeting while she tried to spin it like a misunderstanding. "Misunderstanding," I said, pulling out the printed locksmith invoice I'd picked up myself. "You committed fraud." Her face went pale. The rest of the board looked like they wanted to melt into their chairs, and that was only the beginning. I arrived at the county clerk's office 15 minutes before they opened on Monday morning. The building was quiet, just the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the rustle of paper from early risers in the records department. I wasn't there to make noise, I was there to collect ammunition. The clerk on duty, a thin man with graying temples and a direct stare, raised an eyebrow when I slid the HOA's charter and bylaw request form across the counter. "HOA trouble?" he asked, not unkindly. "Something like that," I said. "I want to see the original filings and any amendments made in the last 5 years. He nodded and disappeared into the back. 10 minutes later, he returned with a thick file folder, the spine cracked and worn. I spent the next 3 hours at a side table flipping through every page, making notes and snapping photos of anything that looked out of place. I wasn't a lawyer, but I didn't need to be one to spot inconsistencies. There were 3 separate amendments to the HOA charter that had never been filed with the county, one of which included a clause giving the board temporary discretion over unoccupied community properties during sanctioned event weekends. That clause had Olivia's fingerprints all over it. I highlighted the page and walked it up to the clerk. "This was never notarized or filed properly," I said. "Is it legally valid?" He shook his head. "If it's not filed through our system and not publicly recorded, it's just paper, legally. It doesn't exist." I thanked him, made copies of everything, and drove straight to the Ridge Pine Estates Community Center. I didn't stop at my house. I didn't check my voicemail. I walked through the front doors like I owned the place. The community center was buzzing Monday cleanup after the home and garden tour. Folding chairs scraped across the tile floor, and volunteers were packing leftover brochures into cardboard boxes. Olivia stood near the refreshment table, giving a man in a polo shirt a list of tasks like she was running a military operation. She saw me approach and instantly went stiff. "I need the board in the conference room," I said loud enough for half the room to hear. "Now?" She opened her mouth, closed it, then gave a brittle nod. Within 10 minutes, the entire board was seated at the long oak table, shuffling papers and pretending not to avoid eye contact. I placed the county file down and slid it to the center of the table. "You've been operating under unfiled amendments, that clause about using unoccupied properties for events. It's invalid. Never recorded, never notarized, which means you authorized unauthorized entry into my property based on fake authority." Stan Jacobs, the HOA treasurer, cleared his throat. "I wasn't aware it hadn't been filed. We trusted Olivia to handle documentation." "That trust just landed you in a legal mess," I said, "because it gets worse." I reached into my bag and pulled out the locksmith's sworn statement. I tracked him down on Sunday and convinced him to record everything in writing how Olivia claimed to be my sibling and insisted the cabin was part of a co-owned trust. The room went dead quiet. "That's identity fraud," said Regina, the secretary. Her voice was barely audible. "Jonah, I didn't know." Olivia's jaw clenched. "This is being blown out of proportion." "No," I cut in. "It's being exposed. You copied keys under false pretenses. You distributed them to strangers. You profited." "I didn't profit," she said quickly, too quickly. "Oh no." I pulled out the last document, a printout from a payment processor showing a payout of almost $800 to a personal account under her name. "Then why did you collect a cleaning fee from the guests and route it to your bank account?" Olivia's face drained of color. "That was reimbursement for supplies." "No," I said. "It was money taken in exchange for access to property you don't own. That's unauthorized use of personal property. That's wire fraud. That's criminal." Stan leaned forward. "Jonah, we need to report this." Regina nodded, and two of the other board members, Deb and Alan, agreed without hesitation. Only Olivia looked ready to bolt. "Don't bother running," I said. "The guests already filed a report when the police showed up." "I gave them everything this morning." Her head snapped toward me. "You think you can ruin me over a harmless weekend?" "I think you ruined yourself," I said. "This wasn't harmless. You impersonated family to a locksmith. You rented out my cabin. You collected money. And you did it all by forging authority you never had." She stood up so fast her chair tipped over. "This board is a disaster. I've spent 5 years keeping this place together, and this is how you treat me." "No," I said evenly. "This is how we deal with someone who treats Ridge Pine like her personal playground." She stormed out, but the damage was done. By Thursday, the board had voted unanimously to suspend Olivia from all HOA duties pending investigation. I filed a civil trespass complaint and a fraud report with the county, and the sheriff's office began pulling security footage from the community center to confirm the key handoff. But that wasn't enough for me. The thing about Ridge Pine Estates is that it's registered as a nonprofit community association, which means its board members are bound by fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of residents. Olivia had violated that duty in spades, so I went back to the county again, this time with a petition. I spent the next week knocking on doors, not with anger, with evidence. I showed people the payment record. I showed them the locksmith statement. I showed them the copies of the unfiled amendments. And I asked them one question. Do you trust this person to make decisions about your home? By the end of the week, I had over 2/3 of the neighborhood's signatures, more than enough to call for a special election. The board met again that Friday, and I handed them the petition formally. "This isn't about revenge, this is about accountability," I said. "No one here is above the rules, especially not the ones pretending to enforce them." Stan nodded solemnly. Deb looked relieved. Regina looked like she wanted to hug me. "We'll hold the vote," Stan said. "And we'll do it by the book." The meeting adjourned without a single objection. Outside, people were already talking, not whispering, talking, openly. For the first time in years, they weren't afraid of board retaliation. Olivia's grip had fractured, and the community could feel it. I walked home that night past trimmed hedges and porch lights flickering on. For the first time in months, Ridge Pine didn't feel like someone else's kingdom. It felt like a neighborhood again, and I wasn't done yet. The notice went up on every mailbox 2 days later. Special meeting HOA board election date. May 18th time, 6:30 p.m. location. Community Center Hall agenda. Vote to remove and replace a board member. The turnout was overwhelming. That evening, folding chairs filled faster than anyone anticipated. Neighbors who hadn't shown up to a single meeting in years were suddenly crowding in, murmuring to one another, eyes scanning the room for Olivia. Some brought their teenage kids, their parents, even out-of-town relatives who'd heard about the drama and didn't want to miss the fallout. I stood toward the back, letting the energy build without saying a word. I didn't have to. People had already made up their minds. The board sat up front, clearly rattled. Stan looked 10 years older. Deb kept adjusting her glasses even when they didn't need adjusting. And Regina had a legal pad in her lap filled with scribbles. Olivia, to everyone's surprise, walked in 3 minutes late wearing a blazer and sunglasses like someone used to showing up at court. "I'd like to make a statement before this begins," she said, walking to the front before anyone could object. Regina leaned toward the mic. "This is a vote, Olivia, not a personal platform." "I have the right to speak," she snapped. "The accusations made against me are exaggerated, misinterpreted. I've given this neighborhood 5 years of my time, and you want to drag me out over a clerical oversight." The room went tense. Then someone near the front, a soft-spoken nurse named Carla, stood up. "You lied to a business to get into someone else's property," she said. "You handed out keys to strangers. You put our neighborhood at legal risk. That's not clerical. That's criminal." The air shifted. Olivia's lips tightened. "I did what I thought was best for the community." "You did what you thought you could get away with," Carla replied, sitting down again. The vote was called 30 minutes later. Out of 142 households, 123 voted for removal. 9 abstained, 10 voted to keep her. The motion passed, but that didn't mean it was over. The sheriff's department had been quietly building a case behind the scenes. I hadn't even known how deep it went until Detective Lorne showed up at my door 2 days later with a folder in his hand and a question in his eyes. "Is this yours?" he asked, holding up a photo. It was a picture of my cabin's lock, except it wasn't the one I'd installed. It was a different model, one that had been quietly swapped out for a few days in April, just before the event weekend. I'd been upstate during that time, hiking with my brother. "No," I said, "that's not mine." "I replaced it after I found out she'd made copies." "Why?" He opened the folder. Inside were photos of a small plastic bag tucked behind a loose board on the cabin's back porch. Inside the bag were 3 sets of keys, not just to the front door, but also to the storage shed and the main gate of the neighborhood. "Found them yesterday during a sweep," he said. Anonymous tip. That bag was stashed with a burner phone and a notebook. He flipped the notebook open just enough to show a few scribbled entries. Each one had a date, a cabin address including mine, and a set of initials next to them. Looks like she was planning to make this a recurring thing. Multiple renters, multiple properties. We're still cross-referencing the names, but it's looking like at least 4 other homes were entered without permission over the last year. I stared at the folder, jaw tight. "And the board didn't know." "Most didn't," he said. "But here's the kicker, we found 2 deposits marked as event reimbursements that were routed through an LLC not registered to her name. It's a shell company, but the registered agent, that's her cousin, and he's got a record." The implications were staggering. She hadn't just violated community trust. She'd used HOA events as a front to run an illegal scheme, renting out private properties under fake listings, collecting payments through a third party, and keeping it all off the books. Lorne closed the folder and stepped back. "She's getting arrested tonight. We'll be issuing warrants for the cousin too. Just thought you'd want to know before it hits the news." By 7:00 p.m., word had spread like wildfire. Neighbors stood on their porches, phones in hand, as 2 unmarked cars pulled into Olivia's driveway. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. She walked out with her coat over her arm, eyes straight ahead, flanked by 2 deputies. The next morning, The local paper ran the headline: HOA president arrested in property fraud scheme, authorities investigating broader network of illegal rentals. The fallout was swift. Regina resigned from her position the next day and personally apologized to every household on her street. Stan, for the first time in years, called an emergency reform committee to review every bylaw, every amendment, and every financial transaction from the last 3 years. A lawyer in the neighborhood, Jordan Patel, stepped forward to volunteer legal oversight for the HOA moving forward. He wasn't interested in politics, just preventing another Olivia from rising again. I didn't attend the next few meetings. I didn't have to. The neighborhood had changed. Kids played in yards without parents peeking nervously through blinds. People waved more. Conversations happened on sidewalks instead of behind closed doors. Trust, once a fragile thing, had started to grow again. One afternoon, Carla knocked on my door with a casserole dish and a handwritten note from her son, thanking me for making the neighborhood safe again. I didn't know what to say. I just accepted it with a quiet nod and a lump in my throat. Later that week, I drove up to the cabin with a fresh coat of paint and new solar lights. I installed a motion-activated camera over the back porch and added a second deadbolt to the shed, not out of paranoia, but because I'd earned the right to protect what was mine. As I locked up that evening and looked out over the treetops, I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about a cabin. It wasn't just about one woman's corruption. It was about standing your ground when someone tries to take what isn't theirs, not with fists, not with shouting, but with evidence, with patience, with a community that refuses to be bullied anymore. And that, I decided, was worth every locked door, every document, every long, quiet week I spent waiting for justice to catch up, because once it did, nothing would ever be the same. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not in temperature, more in atmosphere. The kind of cold that settles in when everyone knows something serious has happened, but no one wants to be the first to say it aloud. I sat in the third row, next to Jordan Patel and one of the other cabin owners, a retired firefighter named Lou. He'd brought a notebook with tabs sticking out the side and didn't look up once he started flipping pages. Jordan leaned over and whispered, careful not to draw the bailiff's attention. "She's taking a plea deal, but if the judge doesn't like it, he can toss it and send it to trial." I nodded but said nothing. My hands were still, but my jaw ached from clenching it. When the door opened and Olivia was led in by a deputy, the room fell dead silent. She looked half her size. No sunglasses this time, no tailored blazer, just a navy suit that didn't quite fit and a look like she'd been scraping sleep together with a spoon. The judge entered and everyone stood. The arraignment was supposed to be simple. But when the prosecutor began laying out the full scope of what had been uncovered, even I wasn't ready for all of it. 11 properties, not 4, 11. 2 of them belonged to elderly residents who were out of state for medical treatment. 1 had been used more than once. Each rental had been masked through different fake listings, with guests instructed to avoid contact with neighbors due to HOA regulations. The shell company, it wasn't just her cousins. It was tied to 2 more entities registered under her maiden name, both created within weeks of Ridge Pine's annual summer events over the last 2 years. The money trail, once pieced together, showed over $30,000 in deposits. But what made the judge's mouth tighten was something buried in the middle of the report. A complaint from a guest who discovered hidden cameras in one of the bedrooms. That wasn't in my cabin, but it was in a property she had accessed using the same locksmith trick. The guest had reported it to the listing platform, but the account disappeared before anything could be verified. Until now, it had been buried in a backlog of flagged complaints. Olivia didn't look up once during the reading. Her attorney tried to argue that she had no knowledge of the cameras, that the cousin had acted without her approval. But her email was on the account. Her number was linked to the check in instructions. Her fingerprints were found on the plastic casing of one of the batteries. The judge didn't throw out the deal. He added a condition: full restitution to every homeowner, a formal apology delivered on record, and mandatory disclosure to every HOA she ever applied to serve on in the future. Then he scheduled sentencing for the following month. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited like vultures. Lou and I slipped out a side exit and walked down to the coffee shop tucked beneath the old train station. The place was quiet, mostly empty. I ordered tea and sat near the window while Lou pulled out his notebook again. "You think she'll serve time?" he asked, not looking up. "Probably," I said. "But not enough. She won't be back," he said. "Not here." I wanted to believe that, but I'd lived long enough to know that people like Olivia didn't disappear. They just looked for quieter places to start over. Still, Ridge Pine wasn't the same anymore. At the next board meeting, Jordan was voted in as interim president. He declined the official title, said it wasn't about status, he just wanted to untangle the mess she left behind. He brought in a forensic accountant, scrapped every unfiled amendment, and introduced a new transparency policy that required all board actions to be posted online and open to resident comment for 72 hours before a vote. The community responded. A group of teenagers offered to build the website for free as part of a school project. Someone's cousin designed the logo. A retired teacher started hosting monthly meet and greets for new homeowners, where people actually talked about more than lawn height and mailbox colors. I stopped by one night just to see it for myself. The room was full of laughter. Someone had brought cookies shaped like little houses. A guy who'd moved in from Colorado was asking about hiking trails. No one seemed worried about who was watching. As I stepped outside, I saw Carla locking up her car. She spotted me and smiled, not the forced kind people used to give when Olivia was around, but a real one. "Feels different, doesn't it?" she said. "Yeah," I replied. "Like we got our neighborhood back," she nodded. "Oh, and the kids on Birch Lane. They're starting a community garden where the old tennis court used to be. You should see it. They drew up plans and everything." That court had been Olivia's pride and joy. She once fined a homeowner for letting their dog walk across it during resurfacing. Now it was being torn up to make room for tomatoes and sunflowers. I went home that night and pulled out the last item I had from the cabin incident, a printed photo of the fake rental listing Olivia had made. I stared at it for a while, then folded it in half and tossed it in the fireplace. No point keeping souvenirs from someone else's lies. The following week, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a typed letter. It was Olivia's apology, court-mandated, emotionally vacant. But there was one line that stood out. "I regret that my actions caused distress to my neighbors." Distress. The word felt small compared to what she'd actually done. But it didn't matter anymore. The apology wasn't for me, it was for the record. 3 months later, the restitution checks arrived. Mine was for just over $3,000. I didn't cash it. Instead, I endorsed it over to the Community Garden Fund. Carla cried when I handed it to her. Said they'd been trying to raise money for a greenhouse, but didn't think they'd hit their goal. They did now. The garden opened that fall. There were pumpkins, corn stalks, even a scarecrow dressed in a retired HOA polo shirt someone had donated anonymously. Nobody said it outright, but we all knew what it meant. Sometimes, justice doesn't come from a courtroom. It comes from watching the place someone tried to control grow into something they never could. And as for me, I still visit the cabin. I still hike the trails. But now, when I lock the door behind me, it's not out of fear. It's just habit, because the locks aren't what keep people honest. The people do.